Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're still managing to keep your sanity. This video is essentially just going to be the starting point for our discussion of 20th century British literature. As always, though, it is very helpful to give the work that we'll read some context by talking about what life is like at the turn of the 20th century in Great Britain. One of the big focal points of our discussion of British culture surrounding art has been the accelerated and very aggressive pace of change in the social structure and the normal way of life for people in Great Britain at the time. And that pace of change is not going to slow down as we enter the 20th century. The primary impetus of the necessity for all the social change is just the vastly increasing population of people living in urban city centers. This, of course, means London, but as we enter late stage industrial revolution, populations in cities all across England and all across Europe and all across the world are drastically increasing as people move to cities looking for jobs that pay wages as opposed to living in their own subsistence lifestyle out in the country. The population increase in urban centers means that these cities have to start thinking more about how to deal with the large mass of humanity living in a generally confined and localized space. More social thought is being spent on thinking about the masses than is being spent on thinking about the individual. Socially speaking, this means a rapid evolution in terms of social justice and social services. This is a period of time where laws are drastically being changed in order to expand the rights of people who have previously been marginalized. In terms of social services, more emphasis and attention is being placed toward things like sanitation, keeping the peace, public protection, crime investigation, and probably most importantly for the discussion of literature, public education, which meant for the first time you had a populace that was largely literate. On top of that, technology would continue to advance by leaps and bounds. Around the turn of the century, you had things like electricity, photography and radio, and eventually cars and flight. All of this drastically changed the way people all over the world thought about themselves in terms of their relationship to society, but it also caused the erasure of things that had brought a lot of people comfort up until this time. Things like religion. As science began to expand into fields such as psychology, human behavior, biology, and anthropology, people often found themselves feeling a little bit unmoored and isolated, even though they're living around hundreds of thousands, or in the case of places like London, millions of people by this time. These rapid changes had a profound effect on the art world and on literature in particular. Essentially, the effect that all this rapid social change had on the art world is that it split the art world in two. Art became separated into categories generally known as highbrow and lowbrow. This is a split that has been a long time coming. Think back to William Wordsworth and his preface to Lyrical Ballad. As he is expressing the goals for his poetry and what he sees as the necessity for a reconsideration of what a poet is and what poetry is meant to do, he specifically says that poetry like his is necessary, especially so at the present day, for a multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion and to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. And he names things like the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incidents, which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. Essentially, what Wordsworth is pointing out is that cities are full of noise and distraction, and for art to flourish in such an environment, it typically needs to be a little bit more sensational and salacious, just for the sake of getting noticed in an environment where so many things are competing for an individual's attention. And that was 100 years before where we are presently. Wordsworth wanted his poetry, even 100 years prior to the turn of the 20th century, to be of a kind that had a little bit more soul than the kind of work that was being produced in such an environment. And certainly not being produced by the kind of spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that he felt should generate good work. And then you can fast forward 50 years to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Men like Dante Rossetti specifically called out the soullessness of art. He was an art student at a time where all art school taught was technique. In terms of the split between highbrow and lowbrow, you're probably fairly familiar with these concepts. Lowbrow art is art that essentially exists to please the masses. The lowbrow is typically defined as being stimulating but accessible and not particularly challenging to your average person's sense of ideals and values. Lowbrow art spoke about popular fears and concerns, and lowbrow art almost always had some sort of message or moral that was meant to be instructive or somehow didactic to its audience, but is often wrapped up in content that is sometimes relying on the sexual, sometimes relying on the horrific, but in most contexts tries to make itself noticeable by being intentionally provocative and stimulating in ways that don't always necessarily speak to anything artistically meritorious. Meanwhile, highbrow art is that art which tends to stand intentionally apart or innately unconcerned with being popular or accessible or even likable by most people. It is art that does not concern itself in any way with mass appeal. Highbrow art pushes us into a movement known as aestheticism. Aestheticism is a movement that essentially says that art's only real purpose is to be beautiful. It rejects the whole notion that art needs to have anything to do with morality or teaching its audience a lesson. The catchphrase that tends to accompany any discussion of aestheticism is art for art's sake. Art just needs to exist. It just needs to be an expression of the artist, and that expression does not necessarily need to be valuable in a social or political context. Many of the artists that we have read so far throughout the semester are now considered progenitors of aestheticism. People like Lord Byron, John Keats, Dante Rossetti, and Oscar Wilde. All of these artists produced work that was pleasing and beautiful, but that had no real mass appeal because of just how esoteric it was. This also means that quite often art that is produced under an aestheticist label is experimental and pushes things further into the avant-garde. Avant-garde, for those of you who don't know, is just a French term that literally means advanced garde, but has come to be defined as art which pushes the boundaries of what is acceptable. Obviously, the notion of beauty is one that is very subjective, and in the art world, disagreement over what counts as beautiful means that art is constantly being pushed further and further into the avant-garde. Aestheticism would lead to a wide variety of movements that sort of get pushed into a larger banner label of modernism. We'll talk a lot more about modernism as we move further into the 20th century. Perhaps somewhat ironically, high art usually includes some form of formal artistic training. This may be a bit weird considering that most of the artists that we have discussed, including a few that we have mentioned in this video, specifically rejected the teachings of the academy as stilted and obsolete, no longer fresh enough to be valid in a contemporary setting. But as art advances, the academy follows, and so by the turn of the 20th century, aestheticism is the norm. As you are probably aware, the line between the highbrow and the lowbrow is one that is often difficult to draw. Defining art with mass appeal as lowbrow means that many of the things that we have read, especially many of the things that we read during the Victorian period, automatically qualify as lowbrow. The popularity of the work of people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Robert Louis Stevenson almost automatically qualifies it as being lowbrow. And the moral preachiness and the didacticism of works of people like Matthew Arnold, you already kind of know how I feel about him. And the political appropriateness of the work of anybody who held the title of poet laureate would, in an aestheticist sense, mean that these are lesser works. It also means that as we move further into the 20th century and other art movements such as Cubism and Surrealism and Dadaism, Futurism, all of these are automatically considered highbrow, despite the fact that even people in the art world didn't know what to do with some of the work that was being produced and exhibited. In 1913, a French artist by the name of Marcel Duchamp put a toilet on display and called it art. In the last 100 years, that debate has continued. Take something like photography. Photography is an artistic medium that just about anybody can involve themselves in without having any skill whatsoever. Just about anybody can pick up a camera and take a picture. And the fact that photography is a medium that inherently lends itself to replication and duplication would, under an aestheticist label, automatically qualify it as low art. But are we honestly going to sit here and say that people like Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adams, and Annie Leibovitz don't have skill as photographers? Also think about music. Most art critics would point to a genre of music like rock and roll as being inherently lowbrow because of how appealing rock and roll is to the masses. But are we honestly going to sit here and say that something like Stairway to Heaven doesn't exhibit a certain amount of skill and isn't artistically beautiful? Is Stairway to Heaven lowbrow just because it's a rock song? And of course, further on down the line, there would be whole artistic movements like the pop art movement that just reveled in what is popular and accessible to the masses. Andy Warhol's perhaps most famous work is simply a painting of a soup can. Perhaps the most popular medium of all art today is television. We exist in a place today where television has never been better and it's never been worse. Are we going to look at shows like Mad Men, Twin Peaks, and Breaking Bad and say that these television shows are doing nothing more than titillating the masses? But essentially, the most important thing to realize about art at the beginning of the 20th century is just how divided it is and how subjective it becomes. The line between the good and the bad just gets blurrier and blurrier as we move forward. And of course, this is just the state of art at the beginning of the 20th century. By the time World War I comes around, everything we thought about the relationship between individuals and society drastically changes. Any concept we had about the inherent meaning of life goes right out the window when you're talking about how expendably individuals are treated for the sake of society. Socially, philosophically, culturally, politically, and religiously, everything is undone by the senseless savagery of World War I. But for right now, that's where we'll start. What we're going to look for in the work that we read from this point on in the semester is the extent to which literature specifically tries to push its own boundaries, redefine itself, and localize itself completely in the experience of the individual. The work that we are going to read from this point forward will become inherently more challenging, a little bit more opaque in terms of its meaning, perhaps a little bit less satisfying in terms of what a piece of work seems to be doing or what it seems to be about. But hopefully by now you've learned to throw those kinds of concerns out the window. So that's all for now. As I sit here and think about the work that we're getting ready to read and about the kinds of conversations that we could have had in person in class, it's going to be very sad for me to have to just talk my thoughts about this work out into the air and hope that you're listening to it. But as we move forward, we come closer and closer to the place in history that we occupy now. Guys, I miss you. I love you. I hope you're well. I hope you're enjoying these videos. But for right now, prepare yourself for some truly badass literature.